It's August 2nd, 2025, and today's storm is eerily similar to yesterday's. And here's today's severe weather outlook, and we can see just like yesterday, we have a risk area out here in the upper plains and another one back here in the southeast. Now, our southeastern risk area is going to be very small and isolated, pretty much only being in southern Georgia and parts of southeastern Alabama. And our upper plains risk area is going to stretch all the way from the Texas panhandle all the way up into western Nebraska. Now, today's start is mostly going to be fueled by the conditional threat of some damaging winds, with that threat overspreading both of our entire marginal risk areas. But the greatest risk of seeing some damaging winds is actually going to be in a corridor stretching from the Texas panhandle all the way up into northeastern Colorado. And here we could see some damaging gusts, possibly even around 70 miles an hour. Then our hail threat is going to be confined to pretty much only the upper plains today. And then the highest risk of seeing some large hail would be in far eastern Colorado, where there would be the conditional threat for some hail, probably over 2 inches in diameter. And then lastly, there's also going to be the conditional threat for a couple of spin up tornadoes as well. So potentially all hazards of severe weather being possible out here in the upper plains risk area today. Now, here are feels like temperatures, and it's actually going to be some beautiful weather temperature wise for pretty much the entire US, being anywhere between the mid 70s and mid 80s today, except if you are directly on the Gulf Coast, you're still going to be seeing some low 100s feels like temperatures, unfortunately. And then the greatest chance of seeing some flash flooding today would be up here in the Texas and Oklahoma panhandle, back up here in southern Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, then even a small blotch up here in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. And in these areas, there would be the conditional threat for 2 to 4 inches of rainfall. Then we do have a marginal risk of flooding, which pretty much spans down from the northern plains through most of the Great Plains and then along the Gulf Coast and parts of the southeast. And that would just be for the conditional threat of 1 to 2 inches of rainfall. And then there is still no tropical development expected for at least the next week, but because it is August, I do definitely think we'll start to see some development happening out here in the Atlantic soon. And here's what the radar could look like in our upper plains risk area today. We're going to start to see some storms initiating by around the early afternoon to midday. Now, these are going to be initiated by a couple of things, mostly just westerly flow and peak heating, but there is also going to be a stationary boundary and possibly a couple of embedded low pressure systems in this. Now, what these storms are going to do is that they're going to start pretty much around the Denver metro. Then they're going to push east with them reaching their peak in far eastern Colorado. Now, at this point, they could potentially be bringing the threat of all hazards of severe weather. So potentially some large hail in excess of 2 inches, some damaging gusts, possibly being even around 70 miles an hour, and even a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes. And then the threat of these hazards would peak when the low-level jet kicks in around the evening hours. By this point, they'd be in parts of western Nebraska, Kansas, and even moving into the Texas and Oklahoma panhandle. And we could actually see a couple of clusters spawned by some outflow of these storms, specifically in the panhandle, where there would also be the conditional threat for all hazards of severe weather. And at this point, it would be very early Sunday morning. Then a couple of other areas to note is that we could see some redevelopment with our low-level jet along some remnant mesoscale convective vortexes, which would just bring the threat for quite a bit of rain up here in parts of eastern South Dakota and Nebraska. And then for our southeastern risk area, it's just going to be a lot of unorganized clusters of storms with a couple of organized clusters, and that would be what mostly brings the threat for that damaging wind threat. And those would be a couple of embedded MCVs along a stationary front, pretty much along the Gulf Coast. And there'd also be a high pressure system bringing some organizational shear to these, but mostly widespread strong thunderstorms, while only a couple of severe clusters expected with only a damaging wind threat. And then this threat would start around the early afternoon and would go all the way into Saturday evening. And then the last spot where the risk of severe weather is actually going to be pretty low, but the risk of seeing some strong thunderstorms is pretty high. It's going to be up here in the northern plains, stretching all the way from the upper plains through to the US-Canada border. And then here are 500 millibar winds, and we can see that in our risk areas. There's just going to be a lot of westerly flow, which is very conducive for some thunderstorms. And there's going to be a couple of high pressure systems bringing some organizational shear. Now, our high pressure system out here in the southwest is actually going to squeeze some of our flow up here in the upper plains, which could make it more conducive for storms and also help to initiate them as well. And that's actually exactly what we're going to see when we see a short wave pushing through pretty much the same time when we're expecting some storm initiation today. And here's a snapshot of the environment out here in the upper plains. And we can see that we have some very straight elongated photographs, and that's also going to be because of a abundant amount of some bulk shear out here, which will help to bring some organized storms and also some strong updrafts, feeling that threat of potentially some large hail. We also see some wind veering, which will help to do the same thing. And we have a lot of Cape up here near a freezing level, then a pretty high mid-level lapse rate, which is also going to be why there is just going to be that threat for some pretty large hail, possibly even being above 2 inches in diameter. Now, it looks like we're going to have some mostly high base storms, which would hinder that tornado threat quite a bit, but it is likely that these would be lowered as we get closer to the evening hours and that low level jet kicks in. So that is why there is that conditional threat for spin up tornadoes, but we do see a moist enough environment with the elevation, and also a modestly unstable environment around 2,500 Cape. So just favorable for severe weather in general today. Then our downdraft Cape is actually going to be quite high at 1,600. Our relative humidity is going to be pretty low, which is good for evaporative cooling and that threat of some damaging winds as well. So mostly a damaging wind and hail threat out here in the upper plains, potentially even with those two being pretty significant. But it looks like our threat of tornadoes wouldn't really be until the low jet kicks in around the evening hours, and still it would be very conditional at that point. And here's our storm environment out here in the southeast, and there's not much to mention except, as usual, it's going to be a very moist environment and a modestly unstable environment at around 2,000 Cape and a 73 dew point, so just very favorable for severe weather in general. And also our 3 Cape's going to be pretty high, which is also favorable for general severe weather. And then as usual, we're going to have a very high precipitable water, which will help to bring that flooding threat, and also potentially some strong downdrafts and some pretty high damaging winds. And our downdraft Cape is going to be 1,100. So another reason why that damaging threat for some strong winds is going to be present out here in the southeast, with potentially a couple of severe storms.